Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to do a provisional cast on your Addi knitting machine. So let's get started. Now, a provisional cast on might seem like a difficult or fancy technique, but it's not fancy at all. It's not difficult at all. A provisional cast on is just a temporary cast on, a cast on that you're going to remove later. I have used a provisional cast on in a lot of my Addi projects. I don't necessarily name it out as a provisional cast on, but I've used it in quite a few of my videos. So anytime that I'm telling you to cast on with a piece of waste yarn, this is what I'm talking about. That is a provisional cast on. We are making a temporary cast on to hold the stitches, hold those live stitches for now while we're knitting, and then after we take it off the machine, then we're going to remove that cast on and do something else with those live stitches. And usually in my videos I graft those live stitches to another set of live stitches or to the other end of my work, usually the bind off edge, which I also tell you to bind off with a piece of waste yarn or pick up the stitches with a piece of waste yarn. That is a provisional it's not exactly a bind off because you're just picking up the stitches, but it's again a temporary way to hold those live stitches until you're ready to graft them. So for a provisional cast on, you're going to need a length of waste yarn long enough to go all the way around your machine, whichever size machine you're using. And that waste yarn needs to be smooth, not fuzzy, because if it's fuzzy or if it's got a lot of fibers sticking off of it, then when you go to remove it, then you're going to end up with some fuzz stuck in your knitting when you take it out, which is not the end of the world because you can pick that off, but it does save a little bit of time to just use a smooth piece of waste yarn, medium weight, or whatever weight you're using. Not necessarily important what weight of yarn it is. But one thing I also want to mention is that sometimes I've seen when people cast on with waste yarn, they'll cast on just like normal and knit several rows with the waste yarn before they start knitting with their working yarn. And that's fine, but I don't feel that to be necessary because you can accomplish the same thing with just a provisional cast on like this with a length of waste yarn. So what I'm going to do first is take one end of my waste yarn, slip it under the first black needle. Now if you're doing this in flat panel mode, then you would start with the first white needle, but regardless you're doing the same thing. So it's not really, it doesn't really matter which needle I'm putting it on. You'll put it on the needle you want to put it on for your project. So I've got it hooked in the first black needle. It's going to go behind the second, in front of the third, behind the fourth, in front of the fifth, behind the sixth, etc., 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 all the way around the entire machine, or until you're ready to stop, where you've got enough needles filled. So as you'll notice, this last white needle is not going to have any yarn in front of it. That's okay. It's not going to be a drop stitch there when you graft it or whatever, because what the cast on the waste yarn is holding on to is not the loop that goes on the needle, but it's the other end of the loop. It's basically, imagine a length of yarn running back and forth in front of the needle and then back down here below the red tab, in front of the needle, back down below the red tab. That's what your knitted row is going to be. So it's going to be catching the yarn that goes down here by the knitted tab, under the knitted tab on both sides of that stitch. So you're not going to have any issues with a drop stitch or anything just because that last white needle is empty. Now if you're doing this on a flat panel, then you want an odd number of stitches so that the last white needle will catch. Because with a flat panel, it's not going to make any knitting on that needle if it doesn't catch. So you're just going to drop both ends of that waste yarn, and then you're going to pick up your working yarn. And I have a little scrap of working yarn here. And you're just going to insert it under the first black needle, or the first needle you want to knit into. and just hook it under the first few needles until that first black needle, or the first needle you put the yarn into, sinks. You're going to stick it into the yarn guide and knit your project as normal. So there's the end of my little scrap of yarn. I'm just going to let it drop. And because this is just a sample, I'm just going to run the machine a couple more rows until all the stitches just come off on their own, like so. And as you can see here, on the one edge, that's just a row of live stitches that we didn't pick up because I just ran it off the machine. But on the other edge, we have our provisional cast on. And as you can see, this is just a row of live stitches with a piece of waste yarn running through them. Just like when you go around the machine and pick up all your stitches off the machine with a yarn needle and a piece of waste yarn, that is what you're creating here, but on the cast on edge. So that now, if this was a real project, I could graft this cast on edge to the other end where you picked up the stitches, or to another piece of knitting, whether it be a flat panel or a tube. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that at the end, the beginning / end of your work, there's going to be a stitch here that is held on the end of your working yarn where you started. So all you're going to do with that is take that yarn out of that stitch so it's not holding it, and thread the end of your waste yarn through that stitch like so. And you notice I did this side of the waste yarn and not this side. This is the side that that working yarn is coming from. So we're putting it on the other end where the working yarn is not coming from, because this stitch was not knit. Again, see, this stitch up here is taller because it's been knit through a whole, another row. So any video where I use grafting, or I tell you to cast on with a piece of waste yarn, that is a provisional cast on. So now that you have this provisional cast on your project, you can either graft these live stitches to another piece of knitting, or you can put them onto, if you're a hand knitter, onto hand knitting needles and knit something else attached to that fabric, and it will be seamless and continuous and flow into whatever you're knitting. So you could pick this up and put it on hand needles and knit a border, knit an edging, a trim, or knit some special shaping, whatever you want to do, because you have this provisional cast on that temporarily holds your stitches for you, so you can do something else with them later. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. If you use this technique in a project, let me know how it turns out for you in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching. Bye.